@Hudson on Twitter. If everyone could turn off or on stun your communication devices so it doesn't interfere with the viewing audience, that would be very helpful. The restrooms, you can leave through that door, and it's right back here, and there are drinks in the back. And at Hudson Institute is the Twitter. I just use the internet, so I don't know. But at Hudson Institute. And rather than, I could go ahead and talk about the significance of this, so I think we all understand that what we've seen in Russia it's interesting. I mean, the potential is unclear, and we're going to have to debate that. But it's very interesting that what people thought was going to be a very boring period of elections turned out to be somewhat exciting, in that you've now got a bit of contentation. You got people, there's some clear dissatisfaction with the current system, but there's still a lot of, as we know, has a lot of administrative support. And so it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. And I think and of course, Russia's significance is well known. I just want to thank, for my participation, the Connect US Fund, who's supporting some of the work Hudson's doing in the area of nuclear security. And we'll be having more events on that area. Hudson, of course, has a long tradition of work in Russia, and we'll be doing more Russia work and Russia-related events in the coming months and years ahead. We're very lucky in that our first speaker is Andrei Poinkovsky. He is a visiting fellow at Hudson. He was resident until a few years ago. He is executive director of the Strategic Study Center in Moscow. So that's where he's been until he managed to come back here to tell us his insights. He's a very well-known political analyst. He writes very frequently. You can read his articles on Novaya Gazeta and the Moscow Times. And he's written several books, including about his favorite Russian political figure, Vladimir Putin, who I'm sure he will regale us with nice, interesting stories over the next few minutes. Thank you, Andrei.
Thank you, Richard, for your kind introduction. I already presented to this audience for the latest 7 or 8 years several talks which can be combined together into a short course of history of Putinism. And I'm very glad today to open a new chapter in this history, which I would call the beginning of the end. Let me begin with official document. This is yesterday's statement of United States Department of State. The United States congratulates the Russian people on the completion of the presidential election. As an infinitesimal part of Russian people, I'm very thankful to Madam Secretary, and I was especially moved that this congratulation was issued just at the moment when my friends were severely beaten and arrested by police after peaceful demonstration in Moscow, headed, by the way, by 2 deputies of Duma. Well, completion of the presidential election. Everybody knows that what happened on March 1st was not election. It was the end, the final stage of special operation, which lifetime ruler of our country conduct once for years. And this special operation began long before the day of so-called election. The first stage was barring all candidates of real substantive opposition. So Mr. Putin invented a game in which he first selected his opponent he selected this time 4 clowns completely operated by him to orchestrate his reappointment. Then he established the rule of the games. One of the rules of the games is that Putin is present 24/7 on TV screens, and as national leader, he doesn't participate in debates with ordinary mortal. Even with this quite innocent and loyal ordinary mortals like Zyuganov and Zhirinovsky. And the rule number 3 is that he is setting the results of the game. Because in authoritarian societies, the so-called public opinion polls are not polls but instructions. But instructions for election falsification. Why opposition participated in this game? We, as in December last year, we participated only with one purpose: to demonstrate once again illegitimacy of this regime, to demonstrate the scale of falsification during such so-called election. Such tactics was very successful in December, and the demonstration on internet provoked a burst of indignation among people who have not participated in demonstration, protest, political activity before. And in December, January, February, we have unprecedented demonstration of more than 100,000 people in Moscow demanding dismissal of Putin. The same task was during this election, and I communicated every day and with every hour the volume of this proof of very massive, very brazen fraud is appearing in internet and the press conference of group of observers, and it again demonstrates that elections vote was rigged and the election is illegitimate, and so the power of Mr. Putin is illegitimate. Even in this statement of Madam Secretary, there is a reference to remarks of OSCU and PASE group about government abusing procedural irregularities and so on. The real question is what after, and the subtitle of our panel is Putinism 2.0 or better. First of all, it's not Putinism 2.0, it's Putinism 4.0. He is running for 4 terms already, which, by the way, is forbidden by our constitution. Everybody understands that Medvedev was a stooge, just keeping the seat warm for returning the real master. But what is Putinism? The first definition of Putinism, moreover, the first introduction of this term was given in one of my articles 12 years ago, during first Putin presidential campaign in 2000. And this article was titled Putinism as a highest and final stage of criminal capitalism in Russia. And since then, by every day of existence, Putinism confirms this definition. There is a lot of talk in the West and in the Russia now about corruption in Russian economic and political system. But to my view, corruption is misleading and inadequate term dealing with modern Russia. Because classical definition of corruption suppose two subjects. A businessman giving bribe to state official. But in our reality, these two subjects merged. They are not giving bribes to themselves. Everybody top Russian leader, beginning with Mr. Putin, and including practically all members of his government, are very wealthy businessmen, billionaire, running their own financial empire. Not formally under this name, under their own name, but I give you the name of two main jewels of Putin's personal financial empire. It's Mr. Abramovich company Milhouse, and it was well known long before, but was revealed finally during Abramovich-Berezovsky process in London. Abramovich Abramovich got Sibneft company for song in 90s by Yeltsin decree, and he sold this to Russian state by Putin decree in 2003 for $13.7 billion. And it's clear that this money, it's not Abramovich's own money. It's he is keeping the so-called obshak. He is a pocket of Mr. Putin. And another his biggest pocket is Mr. Timchenko company Gunvor. Timchenko is an old KGB crony of Mr. Putin. He is Finnish citizen. His company registered in Switzerland, and he exporting about half of all Russian oil. And certainly he also multi-billionaires. I would say that borrowing from Winston Churchill, one of his famous phrases, I would say about Mr. Putin and his closest associates the following: never in the history of human conflict so few have robbed so many of so much. And this reality answers very clearly about all questions about Putinism 2.0, about possibility of new liberal reform under new Putin, and so on. The famous the great Singapore reformer Lee Kuan Yew was once asked, what was the most difficult for you during your process of reforming the country? He said that what's difficult for me was to imprison 5 my closest friends. For Putin to change this system is necessary to imprison not 5, but all 20 or 25 his former colleagues turned into billionaires, and most important, imprison himself, which is absolutely impossible. There is another thing which makes all speculation about new Putin unrealistic and unserious, and it has some relations to United States. On the March 4th evening, he made so-called victory speech. He was very emotional during the speech. Even there were tears in his eyes, and he almost cried about our victory over them. And this, they were not Zyuganov and Zhirinovsky. They were United States of America, who wanted to impose our view for us, who are trying to impose their view on all the world. But we, great Russian sovereign people, we didn't allow them to do it. All his campaign was full of insulting, slandering of United States, presenting them as a fundamental evil trying to destroy motherland Russia and our unique spirituality. And my impression, as Richard noted, I have been writing about this man for 12 years, and I understand him a bit. He sincerely believes in this rubbish which he pronounced, because it's a kind of both psychological defense for himself, and his only propaganda instrument for convincing people. He can't answer to universal accusation Putin is a thief. His only answer is America wants to destroy us, and that's why I should stay at power. But I would say that he's clinging to power now, not so much even because of lust for power, but because of fear of responsibility. And he has no exit strategy, and it complicates certainly the program, the task of saving Russia from this kleptocracy. And this is true not only for Mr. Putin, but for his immediate entourage also, which includes not only his KGB cronies, but so-called system liberals, people who made fortunes and got prominence under Yeltsin regime, such as Chubais, Voloshin, and others. They hate Putin as a head of clan who getting largest share of pie, which was at their disposal completely under Yeltsin. But even more, they are scared by the prospect of facing society, facing people without Putin and his so-called Siloviks. So this very top establishment will cling together, will hang together, not to hang separately, for rather long. But from the other side, they isolated completely from elites, from the real elites of the country, from creative people, from young professionals, from those who getting information from internet rather from official TV channel. And results of election, both in parliament and presidential, show that he already irreversibly lost not only Moscow and Petersburg, but all big city, all young and all educated people. So it will be long battle, but unputination is the only way of saving Russia from kleptocracy and from systemic degradation. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker will be Leon Aaron. and he will offer another Russian perspective, but someone based more in the U.S. who's has a different point of view. He's a resident scholar and director of Russian studies at the American Enterprise Institute, author of 3 books and over 300 articles and essays. For about a dozen years now, he's been writing Russia Outlook, a quarterly essay of economic, political, and social and cultural aspects on the post-Soviet transition, which I believe is on the website, and you can subscribe, as I do, pretty easily. And his books include Russia's Revolution essays, Boris Yeltsin, A Revolutionary Life, or Yeltsin, A Revolutionary Life, and Roads to the Temple, Memory, Truth, Ideals, and Ideas in the Making of the Russian Revolution, 1987-1991. Thank you, Leon, for coming.
Thank you very much, Richard. Long before this election took place, 3 things were already happening that, in my view, for future historians, would mark this election as a watershed at which sporadic protests became a political crisis. And Andrei alluded to some of them. I'll just list them. Well, first of all pro-democracy candidates, leading opposition candidates, were barred from the election. The 3 federal television channels where 95% of the Russians get their news were not just monopolized, that was the case before, but they were turned into an absolutely shameless outlet of pro-Putin propaganda, something that I believe we have not seen before to such an extent. And finally, the votes were counted, if you could use that term, by the very same Central Electoral Commission that was just fresh from its triumph in counting the votes in the December 4th parliamentary election. That is where the massive fraud and falsification has been demonstrated. Now, there are 3 political consequences to these 3 facts. The first one is the massive disenfranchisement of the Russian people in general and the opposition in particular. How massive? There were, according to the polls of the demonstrators, protesters, and of course, you know, they're just the tip of the iceberg. Their support, even within this very limited menu of the people who were running, only less than 4 in 10, 39%, were more or less happy with the candidates that were running. They said that they might support them. The rest said that there's nobody there that they would care to vote for. That's 60% of the opposition and those who stand behind them. The media monopoly meant that the Russian people could not make an informed choice. That's obvious. And of course, the Central Electoral Commission being in charge of the vote. And by the way, the dismissal of Churov, who is the chairman of the Central Electoral Commission, was one of the 3 key demands of the demonstrators. So, what I think these 3 facts and the 3 political consequences lit what I think is a time bomb under the regime. And far from enhancing the regime's legitimacy, I think they subtracted a great deal from it. And a significant part of the Russian population simply no longer considers this regime legitimate. Well, how significant? Again, before the election even happened, according to the Levada Center, 35% of the eligible voters, that is men and women 18 years of age or older, thought the elections would be dirty. This is around 39 to 40 million people. Furthermore, 13%, and again, this is before the election happened, 13%, and that's 14 to 15 million people, have told the pollsters that they were ready to participate in public protests. If 1 out of 10 actually follows through, and I think more than 1 will, that will rattle the regime. Revolutions have started by far fewer people than that. Now, the so-called victory further exacerbated these feelings, that it alienated the protesters even more, and it added determination to their act. Now, of course, there are a minority, as the Kremlin likes to remind us, but so what? Where and when did the regime change, or even less so, a revolution started by the majority? The majority has families to support and feed, and it's the younger, the urban, the better educated that led every successful modern revolution. And make no mistake about this, this revolution or this crisis is spearheaded by a young middle class. Let me give you just a few numbers, and I promise I won't give you any more numbers. There was an entry and exit poll, literally entry and exit to Bolotnaya Square, of the demonstrators. 62% had college degrees or higher. A quarter were younger than 25 years old, and over half were younger than 40 years old. Almost half were professionals, and almost a quarter either managers or owners of their own businesses. College students were the third largest group, represented 12%. A plurality voted for the party of intelligentsia, that is Yabloko, but more importantly, I think 7 out of 10 protesters identified themselves as liberals or Democrats. And there's I think, bad news for the Kremlin in this demographics, because it really is a mirror image. No, I should not say a mirror image. It's a copy of the dynamic that drove the classic modernizations as described by Huntington or Bell or Lipset. That is to say, a middle class that has radically expanded under the Ernst Young regime, that has became personally, each of them, became rather well off and enjoyed personal freedoms, now demands a say in how the country is governed. And this, of course, is the road that was traveled in the 70s in Southern Europe, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and then in the 80s by the Asian tigers, Taiwan and South Korea. My late friend, the great Russian reformer, but also economic historian and economist Yegor Gaidar, used to say that Russia is behind 50 years, about 50 years behind Europe. And if you take the events of the 70s, again, Portugal, Spain, the democratization of Portugal, Spain, and Greece, that's about the right time. And I think Yegor would have been even more convinced that he was right, because currently, actually for the last few years, there's been a growing consensus among top Russian, truly, I mean, non-partisan Russian economists and political observers, that the country was facing the problems of such complexity, political, economic, demographic, ethnic, that they could not be solved within the confines of the so-called sovereign democracy, which, as my Russian friends like to point out, is as different from democracy as electric chair from chair. Now, if there were any Marxists left in Russia, they would have liked the neatness of this, because this fits so perfectly in the paradigm of historical materialism, which is that the superstructure, which is a combination of political, social, cultural institutions, is shackling down, is a burden and a block on the development of the productive forces of the economic substructure, the economic foundation. It is clear to everyone that the country cannot develop. The level of corruption, among other things, is such that it's literally paralyzing social and political and economic institutions. Among other things, you could see that not just in the state of education and healthcare, but also, of course, in the fact that the Russians really are investing less and less in their own economy. The net outflow of investment is reaching record levels and is increasing. Now, let's talk a little bit about the protesters themselves, which I think, again, this is a very interesting case. It's the first for Russia. Why? Because they've been spearheaded by men and women who signed up for the protests on Facebook and were inspired by blogs on LiveJournal. They were barely born or very young when the Soviet Union collapsed. And to them, it is a veritable existential monstrosity, a kind of bizarre anachronism for a great and proud European nation in the 21st century to have someone, anyone, in power for 24 years, which of course Putin would be if he serves out this term and then runs in 2018 again and wins. This is 6 years longer than Brezhnev, and this is only a few years short of Stalin. To this generation, sovereign democracy is a daily offense. They don't remember the so-called chaos of the 90s. It is all a distant rumor to them. And they compare themselves not to their parents, already mostly post-Soviet, or even their Soviet grandparents, even less so, but to their contemporaries in the United States, Europe, and Asia, free, democratic, prosperous countries, whose lives they follow on the internet in great detail. And so the key one of the key legitimizing slogans of Putinism, whatever we are, we're better off than in the 1990s, is completely lost on these people. It's a generational thing, among other things. And therefore, the legitimacy erodes every day. Let me conclude by adding some very preliminary generalizations about what this movement is. And of course, it's a moving target. They're evolving and they're changing almost every day. Well, first of all, I think a more precise term for them would be not a political opposition, but a civil rights movement. Its objectives are not so much political as they're moral. They're not so much about an agenda, but about sensibility. And all the best, finest writers, Kirill Rogov, if you've seen a great interview given by Boris Akunin, Andrei Kolesnikov, they all pretty much note that this is a morally fueled movement. Look at their slogans. They're not particularly political. I mean, yes, there's down with Putin, yes, but there's also, don't lie to us, don't steal from us, listen to us, don't step on us. These are the slogans of a civil rights movement that is tired of being disenfranchised and it wants equality before law, which of course they don't have, not just in courts but also on the roads. And just like other civil rights movements before them, Russian protesters seek to effect vast political and social change through a personal and deeply moral effort. They reject violence in principle, and again, they're led, like other civil rights movements, whether in the United States or India, they're led by the middle class that seeks dignity in liberty and democratic citizenship. In this, there is good news for the regime and bad news. The good news for the regime is that these movements are notoriously slow to organize. They're very slow to crystallize politically. They're very slow to produce the leadership structure. The bad news, and I think it's very bad news, is that these movements establish no time limit on their achievement, on the achievement of their goals, and they display a quiet but unyielding determination and patience to persevere as long as necessary. And because these movements are at once organizationally inchoate and morally very charged, they're very hard to co-opt them or manipulate them in any way. Their leaders, such as they are very difficult to bargain with or bribe with the promises of riches or government positions. And they will. So what I think this election marks is the beginning of a very bitter contest to the end, and we all hope it will be nonviolent. But I don't see how this regime and these protesters that are in demographically, social, and cultural different universes, how they could ever reach a compromise. I don't think such compromise is possible, which again does not look good for the regime. Let me end, since we're talking about years now. My sense is that this regime may not last through the end of 6 years. I think it may end 2-3 years from now, when Russia has to 2014, 2015, or even 13 undertake massive belt tightening, and with little legitimacy, it's very difficult to do. But even if somehow, by some miracle, it lasts till 2018, on this I'm totally certain that Putin will not even start his second 6-year term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. Just to remind people, the Hudson Twitter name is @Hudson Institute, and my email address for any questions you might have is WEITZ, White's last name, @hudson.org. Our third speaker will be Glenn Howard, who's president of the Jamestown Foundation. He is fluent in, get this, Russian and proficient in Azerbaijani and Arabic. That's nice. Having that kind of combination, I'm very jealous. He's a regional expert on Caucus and Central Asia, and he was just in the region, so he's going to give us the regional perspective there. He's also a formal analyst at the Science Applications International Corporation, better known as SAIC, Strategic Assessment Center. His articles appear all over the place, Wall Street Journal, Jane's Defense Weekly, and so on. He's a consultant to various private sector and government agencies, and he, as best known, is really having pioneered and restructured Jamestown as probably the leading authority in this area, particularly in Central Asia, the Caucasus, outside Russia, where there is a lot of competition. But beyond that, they really have a lead in the publications of dominating the former Soviet Union, and they've also got a strong China section and a strong terrorism section. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a great honor to be here today, and it's also a great honor to be on this panel with Andre and Leon. It certainly would have been in the audience today to hear their comments and observations about the elections in Russia. I am the president of the Jamestown Foundation. If those of you not familiar with Jamestown, I encourage you to visit our website at www.jamestown.org and subscribe to Eurasia Daily Monitor, which reaches about 15,000 subscribers around the world every day who try to stay attuned to what's going on inside Russia, the post-Soviet space, as we call it. And also, we cover Turkey. And so we are really, truly Eurasian in that sense. And my purpose in today's discussion is kind of provide some of my thoughts and observations about the elections, but do it from a post-election security environment of kind of surveying the post-Soviet space and how things may evolve in that region, in the post-Soviet space, following the election. And it has been something that I suggested to Richard, which he graciously allowed me to talk about, because it's something that I closely follow. I just came back from Georgia, and so I kind of have I certainly have a strong sense of what is going on in the South Caucasus per se. But before I kind of go off and talk about the Russian perspective of the post-election security environment in the post-Soviet space, I kind of wanted to, I've been thinking a lot about how the Obama administration is going to try to react to this development. And I think it's something that I just would like to kind of share my observations and thoughts on that before we move to the Russian side, because I think how the U.S. reacts to this and to developments in the post-Soviet space are going to be very important and very, very high priority for the United States. And it's also a lot of danger signs in the 7 months ahead before we have our own November elections. And I think that the best way to describe the Obama administration right now is that they're in an extremely awkward position. They've been in the period of orchestrating the reset button with Russia. They have been pushing for the idea of Medvedev as a very important interlocutor with the United States, the face of modernization, the face of a new liberal, enlightened Russia that is an important ally for the United States, and has become, a very important ally in many areas that it's trying to put some priorities on, particularly with the ongoing situation in Afghanistan. And in that regard, you have the United States. Russia has emerged as part of a very important route they call the Northern Distribution Network for supplying U.S. Supplies and non-lethal weapons through U.S. troops, through Central Asia, via Russia, and also through the South Caucasus, through what they call the Caucasus Spur of what they call Indian South. Through that route, approximately 25% of all U.S. supplies are going now through Azerbaijan, Georgia, en route there. Secretary Gates, when he was in Baku in 2010, he said that there are approximately 100,000 American troops every year were flying just through Azerbaijani airspace en route to Afghanistan. So you can see that this is there's some very important strategic corridors in the United States. Relations with Russia and the South Caucasus remain very high priority, very important. And I think that if one were to characterize, I think, the next coming months with the Obama administration, I personally feel that they're headed towards a stagnation phase. I think that it's created the Obama administration has prized its relationship with Medvedev, but Putin for the Obama administration is an unknown entity. They don't feel very. There's going to be a certain level of being uncomfortable with Putin and realizing that he carries a lot of baggage, and this is going to be very cumbersome for the administration. That explains why Andre was showing the press release from yesterday. I think that's why they jumped the gun and congratulating Putin on the elections. I think that the debacle that happened with Michael McFaul and when he arrived in Moscow put them on a very unsure footing that kind of made them recoil a little bit and then try to recalibrate their efforts to engage a kind of new Putin-led Russia. So I think that's a very important aspect to consider. And I think that the Obama administration is going to have some very important strategic goals to keep, it's been emboldened by the Russia's entry and Georgia's consent to allow Russia into the WTO. I think that's very important to them, and I think that they have some leverage with Putin and in trying to interact with Russia under his guidance in the 7 months ahead. And I think that will not hold long because there's a variety of other issues that are coming up that will force them to try to have to interact with them, especially the part where they have to think about not only going to deal with Putin for another 6 years but possibly 12 years, even in the U.S. relationship. I mean, I agree with some of the comments, observations today. I mean, Putin may not last throughout this first term, and definitely most of the pessimists would even say that at minimum Putin is going to probably end in one administration, not two, or one term. And so I think that leaves to a lot of questions that are kind of hanging over the administration as they try to go ahead and engage with them. So the other part is that the administration will have some difficulties because Putin is basically wounded, and so trying to engage a president who just won this election, where they congratulated him yesterday, and dealing with a wounded Putin is also going to be very dangerous. He's dangerous for a variety of perspectives because, on the one hand, being a Soviet man, he's witnessing the complete collapse of a loyal Soviet ally with President Assad in Syria. They're fighting what I would call to quote Zhirinovsky, the последний бросок на юге, the last toss to the south of this idea of a concept of still retaining a Mediterranean foothold and being a naval power in the Mediterranean. That with the collapse and looming collapse of the Assad regime, for those of you who remain optimistic about it, is going to create a really strategic shock for people in Moscow, and that will have, I think, repercussions for the U.S.-Russia relationship as the U.S. remains determined, Turkey remains determined, its allies remain determined to keep the pressure on in Syria. And so this is something I kind of wanted to highlight, and all the various aspects. Now that's enough about kind of outlining what about what the United States and how the Obama administration may deal with it. I'd like to move on to how we kind of perceive what really matters, and that's Russia's perceptions of the changing security environment. And I think if anybody's been following kind of what Putin has been saying in the months ahead, or in the months preceding the elections, you can see that Putin has been very, he's had a lot of things on his agenda. He's made several statements. He continues to kind of indicate where he sees Russia going in terms of the overall U.S.-Russia relationship, but also in terms of Russia's position in the post-Soviet space. And the most and clearest areas is his concern about the U.S. missile defense plans. I mean, he made a comment about that recently, and what he perceives and what the Russian leadership perceives is American subterfuge to gain the upper hand militarily over Moscow. And this is what many people equate to zero-sum mentality in Moscow. I think there's a lot of institutions in Washington, and there's a lot of people that have been trying, and I'd say the Obama administration has tried very vigorously to try to get the, to eliminate and help Moscow get over its zero-sum mentality view of the post-Soviet space. But it's basically something that is Moscow just cannot, they can't abandon that type of thinking. And so, and if there's anything that I would call Putin's new agenda in terms of his new administration coming in, it would be called unfinished business. And I think Putin has a lot of unfinished business in line, and if you follow some of the statements he made before the election, Georgia is very, very high on his radar. And I think that that's a very important aspect of kind of, as we look in the next 7 months, there's a lot of things coming down the road that are going to really affect how Putin views the post-Soviet space, how it views the Caucasus. And that's very, and I'd like to, at this point, just kind of, the key thing that, if you've noticed Putin's rise and before the election, there was a certain series of events and things that were very much choreographed. And if you take the position that a lot of what Putin has been preparing before he came into power again the second time, there's certainly an agenda, and there's certainly a security plan that he has in place for what he's trying to accomplish. The Eurasian Union is just one example of that. The Eurasian Union, some people claim, is just rhetoric. It's Putin trying to please the conservatives. But I've emphasized that Putin is really a Soviet man and has a Soviet mindset, and that this very much matters in terms of his overall game plan. To quote Paul Goebel, he says a very important thing about Americans is that Americans play checkers and Russians play chess. And I think that when you think about that, there's certainly Putin as Grand Master has been trying to play a chess game in the post-Soviet space, and he certainly has a certain series of aims and agendas and programs in place where he's trying to keep pursuing that overall strategy. I'm not saying here that he will be entirely successful in that. I think there's a few speed bumps in the road, and I think that it won't be a complete smooth ride for him. But with the crackdown in place and on a restive middle class in Moscow, things are going to certainly be very difficult for him. But as we kind of look and view at Russia and its future, in the near future, there's a couple points that I would very much like to make. Being president of Jamestown and having to deal with about 200 analysts around the world, it's always my great fortune to be able to look at a lot of analysis and research coming from different analysts. And one of the striking things today is, as you sitting in the audience, I think we need to keep in mind is really where is Russia going as a country? And nothing glares at you more than the overall state of the demographic question. Russia's facing a demographic nightmare, and I really believe that Russia's great power status is in danger. And why do I say that? Because according to some estimates, Russia will experience a 70% population decline that will see Russia's population drop from 140 million to one estimate estimates that by 2050 it'll be 52 million. Other statistics are less gloomy. They claim the population drop will be 107 million. Today, Russia's child mortality is twice that of the European Union, and some experts believe that Russia's population falls below the 100 million mark, that Russia will no longer be able to function as an industrialized nation. These are some of the statistics that I've read and come in contact with. Another very interesting thing is that by 2025, there will be no ethnic Russians living in the Northeast Caucasus. And by that, I may refer to Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia. The only pockets of Russians still living in the Caucasus will be in Kabardino-Balkaria and also in Karachay-Cherkessk. And so this is, and I think this danger is one thing that is in some ways hobbling Russia's ability to act as a great power, and are also at the same time something that's fueling Russia's drive as it looks at the key areas. Putin himself illustrated this point right in the election when he became a very important op-ed contributor when he started writing these editorials about, and a series of them, but one of them caught my eye when it was in Komsomolskaya Pravda. When he talked about the demographic threat, he devoted a whole page of writing to that where he talked about Russia's demographic crisis turning Russia into a voided space. And in fact, as one demographic observer remarked, he says, pretty soon there will be no one left for the Russian army to draft, which was in fact the title of an RIA Novosti article in November 2011. Same time, you have Russia's Muslim population growing to 20 million by 2025. And today, every Chechen is now having 5 kids. And you've even had the Kadyrov in Chechnya has called for every parliamentarian to have at least 2 wives. And so you can actually put this population drive into comparison to what's going in the Muslim South has a lot of striking things about it. And so this is obviously putting a huge burden on Russia as it struggles to maintain its imperial borderlands. I think, you know, you've had it, one of the key feature of the opposition, Moscow, has created the chant of stop feeding the Caucasus. I think more and more in the minds of some members of the opposition, they attach a great level of corruption to the Caucasus and what's going on there. They're further enraged when they see 100% voting results coming back from the North Caucasus, which is a complete farce. But these all the things, all the dangers of avoided space are some of the things that are undermining Russia's aspirations to remain as a European power. Now, no talk of mine can be complete without some reference to Zbigniew Brzezinski. And so, former member of our board and someone I worked with on the American Committee for Peace in Czechia for many years. One of the interesting things in his new book on strategic vision, America and the Crisis of Global Power, is that he says that Russia's demographic weakness will leave Russia with no other choice than to align itself with the West. Because of this vast glowing demographic weakness, the only other choice is to align itself with China. And that is an option that Russia won't pursue. And so it's a very interesting observation. It's something that's very important. And so getting back to the grand strategy and Putin as a Soviet man, I want to move away from the issue of demographics and talk about the nostalgia that Putin feels. And this nostalgia of someone who said that the greatest calamity was the collapse of the Soviet Union, but is also someone who quotes Tsarist officials like Stolypin, who created the Stolypin necktie. It was very much often used at the turn of the century against Russian revolutionaries. But when it comes to grand strategy, the one thing that I want to point out is that in 1921, the Soviet Union had 3 basic geographic objectives, and when they were trying to recreate the Soviet Union. And part of those, it was part of a concept they called forward defense. Forward defense is very important because in the notion of grand strategy, it revolves around geography, and specifically around 3 regions that were very integral to Russia's or Soviet Union's renewed forward defense. Those 3 countries were Belarus, Armenia, and Tajikistan. From these 3 states, Moscow could project its influence to influence things that have not changed much as you can see today. That's why these 3 states retain an important role in Russian aims, and benefit from these regions is very important to reestablishing a leverage in certain geographic locations, and they're very important parts of the post-Soviet space. Now, returning back to the role of geography, I would like to point out that as Russia is concerned with the Caucasus is really Russia's gateway to the Near East, and consolidating the Caucasus is a means to end further strategies. There was a former head of the National Intelligence Council that was here in Washington at one time at a conference. That person basically was talking about how Russia was able to conquer Central Asia before it conquered the Caucasus. Well, historically, that was an inaccurate fact. The fact is that Russia was able to conquer the Caucasus, and then only once it consolidated the Caucasus was it able to turn to Central Asia. So, why in the element of grand strategy am I talking about this? Well, because the Caucasus is important. The Caucasus is a central element to this grand strategy. To quote Yeltsin's former defense minister, Pavel Grachev, he who controls Georgia controls the Black Sea. So Georgia, in the scheme of things, remains an integral part of Russia's aims, and Putin won't be satisfied until he's completely ousted Saakashvili from power and Finlandized Georgia or completely dismembered it. This was the game plan in 1921, when from Armenia, Russian Soviet troops entered Georgia, and they tried to regain control of Georgia, and that this is still remains a core historical aspect that also influences Russian grand strategy in the South Caucasus. So enabling this is the South Caucasus is a part of Russian grand strategy, is also very important to the counterinsurgency campaign in the North Caucasus because it can't consolidate and totally eliminate the counterinsurgency in the North Caucasus without subduing the South. These two go hand in hand and play together for the whole aspect of what Moscow and what Putin's strategy is. Now, everybody in this room knows that Putin has a severe disliking for the Georgian president, Misha Saakashvili, and it's really, it's something that's very personal. Now, getting back to this, what I perceive as regional trends and warning signs emerging in the next 7 months. There's certain key trends that have been emerging that we need to keep in mind. I think are going to be very important on Moscow's radar screen as we try to look at the region. And the first of these is that Moscow and Putin will continue to use a lot of rhetoric as they discuss the possibility of a U.S. war with Iran and the role of the South Caucasus in U.S. plans to attack Iran. The specter of a possible U.S. attack against Iran and this Moscow's lingering mistrust of U.S. aims in the Near East is really something that's kind of, it doesn't stand a great chance, but it's certainly something being used to further Russian aims. The first, and within that, what's important to understand is, again, goes back to geography, is that Russian military bases in Armenia are in severe need, and Russian military equipment there is in severe need of modernization. The troops in Russian has about an estimated 12,000 troops in Armenia, and Russian officials have completely, in newspapers such as Nezavisima Gazeta, have recently written about the notion of breaking the blockade. And so many of those that have come in contact with some of our Georgian colleagues will know that that this concern about a war against Iran, a U.S. attack against Iran, that Moscow may use the idea of a threat of transiting its troops from South Ossetia into Armenia as a means of bolstering its position in the south. This is very critically important to Moscow's position in the South Caucasus. It further allows it to put pressure on Georgia. So this is a very key component of what we're seeing. The other idea that's another key strategic aim is the idea of a unified air defense corridor in the South Caucasus. Why am I talking about this? Well, in Washington, not many people pay attention to military technological developments related to sophisticated air defense weaponry being put in the South Caucasus. But from this, if you talk about and discuss where this weaponry has been deployed, then it suddenly becomes clear. First of all, you saw the deployment of S-300s in Abkhazia. Then you saw the deployment and sale within Armenia of S-300s. And playing both sides, Moscow has sold Azerbaijan S-300s. And so, in addition to delivering the weapons, it's also at the same time arming different sides. Now, why is S-300 important? That goes back to what I was saying earlier about 100,000 American troops flying through the South Caucasus. Anybody that knows with S-300s and batteries put in different republics, that sophisticated weaponry like that, the S-300 doesn't necessarily come with batteries included. It comes with Russian advisors, and it comes with a lot of things that help support S-300s. And so I'm not saying that the Russians have control of the switch in Azerbaijan, but it certainly creates the notion that this equipment is in some way controlled by Moscow. Why is an unified air defense corridor important? Well, one of the great tragedies of the post-Soviet space and the collapse of the Soviet Union was that it lost an air defense corridor to the Middle East that was through the South Caucasus. That's why in negotiations with Azerbaijan today, Russia is trying to they're discussing payment of $150 million And with the weakening of they perceive of Putin in Moscow, these areas have suddenly doubled the ante to now asking $300 million for the basing of their radar station at Gabala. So this is the air defense corridor is very critical. Last point, or one of the final points to make, is that in 2012, in September, we're going to see, once again, new military exercises called Caucus 2012 in the South Caucasus. These will be strategic exercises that will have a tactical operational element to them. They won't, according to the Russians, won't involve a lot of troops, but they are going to involve elements of the separatists in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia, and also include Soviet or Russian troops in Armenia. So the focus of this will be surveillance, air defense, and logistics, and that Russia's tailoring the exercises to prepare for a so-called U.S.-Israel-Iran war. So these things, and many of you who know and follow what happened in August 2008, know that the invasion of Georgia was preceded by extensive military exercises in the North Caucasus in July of 2008. They used those military exercises to conceal their movements for the invasion of Georgia. Very important element, but again, history is relevant here, and this is why I bring it up. And then on February 23rd, you had Putin spoke about the threat of the U.S. rearming Georgia, and that followed his 19 January statement where he was talking about Georgia's role in U.S. missile defense. So you take all these factors into consideration, Georgia, in my opinion, is going to be the real key target in the 7 months ahead. There's a lot of unfinished business in Georgia. This combined with the wounded Putin politically in Moscow, the face of losing Syria, and faced with also this glaring reality of the demographics of the demographic problem in Russia. It's Putin's last, as to quote Zhirinovsky's, his last toss to the south, and I think this is very critical because the South Caucasus controlling, consolidating Georgia has an impact on Azerbaijan. It bottles up Central Asia. It leaves Russia in a new position in the Near East where it has a very important role to play. And certainly if it can't do it overtly, it will do it covertly. I would point out that the recent bomb blast or bomb that was thrown over the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Tbilisi that was traced back to Colonel Borisov, a GRU colonel in Abkhazia. There's enough sufficient evidence that there's certainly some effort being made and is underway to try to undermine the stability of Georgia. This all comes in light of Georgia's now being able to independently produce different types of military equipment, and by this armored personnel carriers, multiple launch systems, things that Georgia's managed to build by itself, escaping an arms embargo that was placed on it after the 2008 war, is certainly a burr in the saddle of Putin, because it's certainly showing that Georgia has an independent capability to take care of its defenses. And now with the lifting of the U.S. signaling it's going to renew military cooperation with Georgia, this is creating a new, what I would call, sense of urgency to what is happening in the South Caucasus. So, and then you have the situation in Tajikistan where the Russians are trying to get back their border troops inside Tajikistan on the borders. They're currently renewing this. And again, the old adage that I said about Armenia, Belarus, and Tajikistan playing an important role is you keep your eye on those three areas, but I think the most important danger sign in the days and months ahead will be and continue to be Georgia and in the face of a wounded Putin. And
excuse me, we're having a problem in the back there. What's up? Okay. Let me think. All right, time out. Okay. So are we okay to continue? Okay. So all right. I'm just.
I'm fine. I finished. So that's. I think that's one thing to say. This is something to leave on your minds as you survey the landscape of what's around Russia, how Russia's changing. It's not just the demonstrators in Moscow and the revolt of the middle class, but it's also it's the periphery. And so, thank you very much. And
Okay, thank you, Glenn. I'm just going to end with a couple comments on building up on the U.S.-Russia relationship. First, I think we should acknowledge that there's been some progress over the last few years in certain levels. The rhetoric of the relationship's come much better since Putin left office in 2008. We've seen growing cooperation on Afghanistan, even on Iran, a very controversial issue. We've seen the Russians made a major concession, deciding to cancel the sale of their most advanced air defense missiles. But none of these achievements, and there are a couple others, are guaranteed. And in fact, even if you stop moving forward, it'll be easy to start sliding backwards, because there's been a sentiment in some of the concessions people made that they would get other benefits in return later. And if they don't appear, you're going to see frustrated expectations. Now, these achievements were made under Medvedev, but of course we know that Putin had to prove them, that he'd remain the dominant authority. And it's not necessarily a guarantee that the relationship needs to become worse when he comes back to the presidency. He has shown a very pragmatic streak. So when he first came into office, he made some major economic reforms. And then because the oil prices rose, he no longer had an imperative to do so, so he stopped. But it shows that when necessary, he's willing to make some changes. He was not hostile towards the United States, at least in public initially. The Russians accepted the withdrawal of the United States from the ABM treaty without major complaints. They just said it was a mistake, but they just let it go. The U.S. deployment in Central Asia, they weren't happy with, but when the Central Asians decided to go ahead, at that point, they decided to acquiesce. So we have evidence that, given the right positive and negative incentives, he can be pragmatic and not necessarily confrontational towards the United States. Domestic politics, Russian public opinion sometimes comes off as being hostile to the United States, but it's very much elite-driven. I think you can see that if a change in tone on the part of the state-controlled media, that could easily eliminate that. And as we know, Russian domestic opinion in that area is not major constraining on foreign policy in any case. Here, public opinion does matter, but Russia is not a salient issue. Most people don't think about Russia anymore. We no longer see it as a threat. Focus on domestic issues, China, Iran, whatever, but Russia is not. The one area where, of course, Putin's return could be a problem is going to be in the Congress. The Congress isn't anti-Russian per se, but it is anti-Putin. And so it's going to be harder for the Obama administration and any future administration that might come to power in 2013 to get congressional approval for example, another arms control agreement, major economic concessions, and so on. There are also structural constraints in how disruptive Russia can become. Its economy and military is nowhere near as strong as it was during the Soviet period. Russia, the nuclear deterrence will persist no matter what happens in the Russia-American relationship, and that will another constraint. Russia's more integrated in the world economy than it was during the Soviet period, so that will have some constraints. And all these factors, I think, are quite evident. We sometimes forget, in, for example, the recent crisis over Libya or disputes over Syria. During the Cold War, one of the things we'd have to consider about, well, if NATO intervenes in Libya or takes some action in Syria, well, what's the Soviet Navy going to do? What can they put their nuclear force on alert, etc.? That doesn't come up. Russians have given no indication that they plan to have any military countermoves, and I don't think they really have any good military countermoves to what's going on. So it's all more diplomatic and using veto power and so on. There are also other constraints on what Putin's ability to get things done. There's Russian economy is not as strong as it was when he first came into office, or at least a few years later. His popularity is reduced. There's more resistance as Glenn pointed out, in the former Soviet Union, in some of his projects, such as the Eurasian Union. Focusing on the area of the arms control relationship in particular, as far as I can tell, the New START agreement is going well in terms of implementation. There haven't been the kind of major disputes you've sometimes seen over the arms treaties. But it's beyond that, it's not really clear what progress we can make beyond for the next steps. I mean, you've got a fundamental asymmetry in that the Russians are much more concerned about missile defenses, our missile defense, and the conventional forces imbalance, whereas the Americans are more concerned about constraining nuclear forces. So you could theoretically get trade-offs. It's going to be very difficult. I mean, Russians made clear that their response to the ballistic missile defense system, and Putin writes about this in his Moscow News article on defense, is going to be asymmetric. They're going to just build up whatever nuclear forces they think they need to overcome U.S. missile defenses. A new development, which is going to present some problems as we go forward, is the Russians are much more insistent now on legally binding agreements. They argue that we violated previous political declarations about not expanding NATO, and a couple others they think that have been violated. So they want to make sure anything they sign is legally binding. And some of the things they're asking, we just can't do. I don't think the Congress or the American president could sign a treaty, for example, deliberately constraining U.S. missile defense progress, because that means you're basically telling the American people that if we even have the technical capacity to defend you, we're not going to, because we have an agreement with Russia not to expand the program. And I think that's a non-starter, but the Russians still insist on that. The Obama administration is offering political guarantees, but again, for the reasons these aren't accepted. So I think that these constraints are going to limit what the next president in the United States can do, whether it be President Obama or the Republican. I think at best we might see some limited progress in other areas. Counter-nuclear terrorism is something that both countries have cooperated well on, we sometimes forget. And since they're both trying to push revival of civilian nuclear power, that's something they're very concerned about, promoting a safety and security culture. On proliferation, the Russians generally don't want any more countries to get nuclear weapons, and we certainly don't. They have to agree because of the veto imperative, the veto rights they both have in the Nuclear Security Council. The problem is more, of course, in tactics and trade-offs. So in the case of Iran, I don't think the Russians are going to make many more concessions. They think they've taken a lot of hits with the relationship, and they're just not willing to confront the Iranians anymore because of their economic interests, different assessments of Iranian motives. And they have an interest, of course, in keeping the West divided and Iran alienated from each other, because that allows Russian and Chinese businesses to pretty much dominate the Iranian foreign economic relationship. Korea, though, I think there's more opportunities for cooperation. Both countries would like to end the Korean standoff, would like North Korea not to have nuclear weapons. The Russians have very ambitious plans to have their railroads and their energy pipelines flow through the Korean peninsula, so that would help better integrate Russia into the more dynamic Asian economy. They would like to do their own Asian pivot, but have been less successful than we have. There's also, I think, some opportunity perhaps for considering some confidence and transparency building measures. These may lead to a future strategic arms control agreement a few years down the road from now, but even if not, they might still be useful. So the Russians are not going to make major constraints on their tactical nuclear weapons. They all sorts of reasons. They think they need them for its conventional forces. The Navy considers them very important to. And there's no incentive. There's nothing we would give them that they would take for major concessions. But you could, for example, agree to inspect. We've acknowledged we've withdrawn our nuclear weapons from some countries in Europe. They say they've claimed withdrawn some, and there's some way maybe you could have people do some joint inspections there. The Russians sometimes say they're afraid of the prompt conventional global strike and American cruise missiles. They think we could use them to destroy their ballistic missiles and then use our missile defense system to deal with their ragged response. Most American experts don't think this is a serious scenario, so you could have a joint threat assessment to try and bring that out. Further efforts to try and expand bilateral arms control treaties between Russia and the United States to other areas, I think, would make sense. The INF Treaty is an obvious one, Intermediate Nuclear Range Force Treaty. So far, the only two countries in the world that can't have missiles between the ranges of 500 and 5,500 kilometers, the United States and Russia. But all around Europe, we're seeing China, Iran, everybody going for these range of systems. So it'd be nice to get, if we could, someone else to be constrained. And you could perhaps have some transparency agreement into each other's nuclear weapon production complexes, because if you want to go down further, you have to be sure that the other side can't rapidly build up. These are difficult, but I think they're easier to go for than a conventional arms control agreement. Finally, there's the one area where I think we could see more cooperation on is the civilian nuclear energy front. As I mentioned, both countries are interested in expanding this. We've signed a 1-2-3 agreement allowing us to cooperate more in this area with Russians, develop joint reactors and so on. And I think it'd be useful because, well, the problem we've got the relationship is it's the people who have an interest in good relations are very small in each country. I mean, it's not, we don't really have extensive economic ties. I mean, we don't need their arms and oil, and so that's basically their main output. So it'd be nice to try and expand the agenda, build that up further, because until we do, there's just going to be this fundamental. Basically, we're just going to focus on the things I talked about, the arms control relationship, which is fundamentally adversarial. It'll be nice to be able to move beyond that. But of course, this somewhat depends on some progress in some of the other areas my colleagues have talked about in terms of domestic political reform and so on. So with that, since we lost a bit of time, I'd like to just go ahead and straight to questions from people. And then if you want to comment together and in context comment on each other's observations, you're welcome to do so. But just a reminder, if you want to email me a question, and I'm going to start with one I've already received over the email, it's just at weitz@hudson.org, and then there's the Twitter account, which is at Hudson Institute. We have a question from Anthony Boyer at the IFES, which is an election institute, and he asks, how can Russia's influence upcoming elections in Georgia? He also asked an earlier question, so you can pick one or both of these. What does the panel think of Golos' somewhat more favorable view of the March elections versus the December Duma vote? And then after these, if you want any questions, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone to you. We'll get it on tape. So who wants to take the Boyer questions about what can they really do in Georgia? And
Well, certainly they can travel there now without a visa, so they can go there, and the Ivanishvili that's been mounting a challenge to Saakashvili is certainly got a lot of money behind him, and it's many people speculate that it's a Russian effort to try to undermine and further divide Georgia. But when I was in Georgia last week, it apparently is not being successful. In fact, Ivanishvili is drawing support from the other opposition parties at the expense of the other opposition parties, and that he's polling around 7%, and so he's not going to really mount much of it. It doesn't seem to be capable of mounting much of a challenge to Saakashvili's ruling party. So, but Russians, in many ways, I think Georgians are playing some roles in helping in Russia and the opposition. I think there's some cooperation going on, and so. I think that the lessons of the Rose Revolution are not too difficult to ignore, especially in a social media environment like what's happening in Moscow now.
Okay, does anyone want to take the issue up about the Golos, why they thought this round was more favorable than the December vote?
Sorry?
Golos. They said they have, according to this, they have a more favorable view of the recent elections, the presidential elections, and the Duma ballot. Do you think things have improved? Was there, they spent all that money on that electronic monitoring system?
Well, first of all,
Like
Golos gave their assessment of real amount of votes got by Mr. Putin, and their assessment is around 50%. This would mean, as you see, the falsification of 15%, and practically is the same which most experts, the same figure which most experts gave talking about Duma elections, when the real percentage for Eurasian party was around 30%. It's a huge falsification, and you may compare it with December to argue is it better or worse, but it makes this election illegitimate, and the Putin rule it.
Okay. Sir. Yeah, we need to get the microphone though, so we get it. So one up here. You can just state your name and, if possible, identify any affiliation you might want to get.
Alexis Sapchenko, No Association. Mr. Piankovsky called his presentation beginning of the end. And Mr. Aron expanded, explaining that Russia is more or less going to follow the path of Greece, Portugal, and Spain in 70s. My question is, given the fact that all three Mediterranean countries had specific events which triggered the revolutions, Cyprus invasion, death of Franco, colonial wars in Africa, what kind of telltale signs we should be looking for now in Russia to expect something to happen? Another Bolotnaya rally or the war in Georgia? What else?
You never know about such things. I would like to remind how Vladimir Ilyich Lenin addressed Swiss Social Democrats in February 25 or 26, 1917, and he was asked the simple question about prospect of Russian revolution. He said, "We old people will never see Russian revolution, but maybe you youngsters will live until this moment." You see, the regime reached the stage when he can collapse every day and when he can last 2 or 3 years. And what triggered this event, nobody knows. The February Revolution in Russia, as you know, was triggered by very temporal shortages of pain in St. Petersburg. What triggered off the collapse of Putin regime, I don't know, but all the ingredients of the end of regime are present. It's exhaustion of this regime, death of with ideology. In 1985, no one members of Politburo believed in communism, and no one members of Putin Politburo of these Belarus believe in Putinism now. Alienation of most creative and dynamic section of society. Mass protest. Like Leon noted, far fewer protests sometimes provoked fall regime. I answer this question rather extensive because it's important point to make, because the question about Putin regime is not if, the question is when, and the question about today's situation is why not yet. And my view is it's the only one key ingredient necessary for the fall of regime is lacking in today's situation. And this ingredient is the split of top leadership and the readiness of some of them to sell out dictator. What is the difference between Egypt and Syria? Mubarak fall because generals around him has their exit strategy, and they sell out Mubarak. Assad will last much longer because Alawites around him has no exit strategy, and they will not sell him out because, well, it's Middle East. They were massacred together with him when regime fall. The Putin Alawites, these billionaires around him, also will not sell out Putin because immediately after the fall of the Putin, they face their own investigation, trial, and some very unpleasant consequences. And when I tell you about this Putin Alawites, I mean not only his KGB cronies, but system liberals also, because the real tandem of Russian power is not certainly Putin and Medvedev. The real tandem is institutional. It's Putin's Siloviki and clan of system liberals, if you want personify Putin and Chubais. And certainly people like Chubais, Voloshin, they fed up with Putin, but they never, if they moved on the side of opposition now, the Putin fate will be decided. But they still, as I put it now, hang together. That's why my assessment, it's not tomorrow, but certainly not more than 1-2 years, because he can't solve any existential problem of Russia's stagnated economy, the war in Caucasus, and demographic catastrophe, and a lot of other. So they will be overthrown as Assad's Alawites together, but this loyalty to the dictator will make regime last sometimes.
You know, fraudulent elections may now have taken place of these dramatic events. Remember and I think you had the very astute observation. Indeed, the fall of the Portuguese regime is because of what happened in Angola, the invasion of Cyprus by Turkey and defeat of Greece, the end of the Black Colonels, and of course the death of Franco, 75. But look at what's happening in the past decade. Fraudulent elections have spurred revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and Egypt. And I wonder if that's because the internet made things more transparent, and it's easier to detect the fraud, but also much easier, incomparably more easier to get together in cyberspace and see how many people are with you. And I think that's a huge advantage over the conventional media before the internet. And I think it could be that the fraudulent elections are now sort of at least among the key triggers of these pro-democracy protests and revolutions.
Okay. Any further questions from the audience? Back there in the center, and then we'll do in the corner here.
Yeah. While thanking everyone for their presentations, I have a question for Mr. Glenn Howard. Sir, I would like to hear your comment on the security risks associated with the Russian agenda in the post-Soviet space vis-a-vis the new defense guidance presented by the President Obama earlier this year, which refocuses the American strategic posture in the Asian Pacific. Thank you.
Well, I think the posture in Asia Pacific won't have any impact on the Caucasus other than a political decision made by Obama that that strategic patience with Georgia has really come to an end, that they had decided politically a combination of factors that the return to power of Putin, the fact that Saakashvili had behaved himself and not engaged in any new risky adventures, that Georgia had been a very willing ally in Afghanistan, doubling its troops there, very much engaged, and then finally the concession on the WTO, that finally led to a combination of things led the Obama administration to kind of finally signal to Georgia that it's going to stop the embargo against Georgia and start talking about military cooperation. And this comes in light of the fact that Georgian troops going to Afghanistan couldn't even get spare parts for their M16s about a year, 2 years ago. And so that shows how far they've come, but it's not the guidance on Georgia is still kind of remains to be seen. I mean, there's some indications that they're going to do these things, but one of the points I wanted to make in my presentation that I didn't make is that even the fact that the Obama administration is now talking about providing assistance to Georgia again, outside of the counterinsurgency assistance that they've given, things like helping them develop a military strategy to combat tanks and things like that, and tank warfare. The real thing about the recent decision is even if the Obama administration doesn't come through to deliver on Georgia, what they've done is engaged and done something very symbolically, and that's send a signal to the rest of the countries of the world that Georgia is an open market now for arms, and that will lead countries like Czech Republic, Israel, others now to kind of go to enter the Georgian arms market and start helping Georgia militarily. And so that symbolic act by the Obama administration alone is certainly something that's very, very important, and certainly will, as you can see, it's going to start changing the tide in the South Caucasus. Last week, you had a $1.6 billion arms deal signed between Israel and Azerbaijan. Huge arms deal. And this signifies how, the winds of the Caucasus are changing. It's the strategic direction of the region is changing. You're now talking about NATO exercises, or American troops are going to have military exercises with Armenia the first time ever. So that's why this situation is changing in the region, but it also remains very dangerous, because that's the problem with it. And so you see these trends and these developments, and I think in the next 9 months it's going to be very critical, because Georgia is very symbolically important. A friend of mine in Georgia recently went to Kyrgyzstan to help them with police reforms. Georgia is a very important symbol of Western reforms. A new Western-educated elite is emerging, and that's very dangerous for Russia. It's very dangerous for the region, because you now have groups of people from the North Caucasus driving down for a weekend to Tbilisi using the new visa-free travel regime that they have, and they're spending their money there, and they're engaging in even some discussions with the Georgians in conferences and things. And when the Georgians asked them why did they suddenly decide to do this, and the people in the North Caucasus have responded by saying, because we're thinking about tomorrow. And so I think that again, things, region is changing, but it's also very critical and very dangerous.
Thank you. There's a question over here, and then we can go in the back there.
Ralph Galliano, no affiliation. My question is directed to Glenn Howard. Georgia dropped its opposition to Russian participation in the WTO, and now we see a loosening in the visa requirements for travel between Russia and Georgia. In the context of this election, how would you assess those two policies?
The Georgia election or the
No, the Russian election.
Well, the visa, we shouldn't jump too soon on the lifting of the visa regime for Georgia and Russia, because the Georgia still have a stipulation that you can't travel using a Russian passport if you've been to the occupied territories. So that's something that Georgia is insisting upon. It's still a problem, but it's, there's been moves that, they announced this thing about the air corridor of renewing flights directly between Moscow and Tbilisi. It was supposed to be daily, but it never really, I think they ended up being weekly flights. And so sometimes there's these proclamations made about, like this visa-free travel regime, and it's all posturing. I mean, I think Saakashvili, with a certain element, was trying to cater to his domestic group to try to show that he's ready to engage with Russia, despite the occupation of these territories. And then I think Putin and the Russian Foreign Ministry responded. I think they're also posturing themselves too. And so the question is, what are they going to hammer out? What will they do? But it's certainly leading to a potentially new environment. And I wouldn't exclude, the possibility of a warming trend between Georgia and Russia. But I think there's too many things on the table. It's hard to say which way it may go. But it certainly, Putin does have a pragmatic side. True, but whether and how that may evolve, it's hard to say, because he certainly made a lot of very unsavory comments about Saakashvili, including comments recently about hiding under the table. Again, he brought that up. So it's hard to say. And WTO, I think the Georgians are confident they're going to have Swiss monitors at the border with Abkhazia. Again, Western presence, influence. And I think they're confident that is going to move forward and address their concerns. And they're confident that Moscow has agreed to it, and the U.S. will hold their feet to the fire to at least have those border monitors in. So their territorial sovereignty has been, they found a very convenient means to be able to address that problem, and I think, to a certain extent, possibly that this Russian decision to renew the links with Georgia on the visa-free travel, I think that possibly is connected to the WTO, It would be hard. Putin does have that side to him. It is pragmatic. If he sees the Georgians making that, then he certainly that could have influenced the Russian decision making in that. And I think that's there's some favorable things on the horizon. But you got to realize too that Georgia has made tremendous grounds in its trade relations and diversifying its trade. Used to be totally dependent on the Russian market. Now they're for their wine exports. Now the total market with Russia used to be around $81 billion a year. Now the Georgians have climbed back up to $51 billion a year in wine exports, and it's all going to Kazakhstan. And so it's and I think that again Moscow shot itself in the foot. And it made Georgia stronger because it diversified its trade, and now they're producing their own weaponry, and boy, that's got to that's a historical first in the Caucasus, in my opinion. But
may I also say some words on it?
You're actually a Georgian citizen, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, Georgia is becoming a very important issue in this discussion. So I would like to make an observation. To my view, West and especially United States have a very serious deterrence, very serious leverage against Putin kleptocracy and him personally. I mean that they keep their multi-billion dollars bank accounts, assets, real estate holdings in the West. And a demonstrative freezing some of the assets, for example, of Mr. Abramovich and Mr. Timchenko, quite legal, because you have the legislation against laundering of criminal capitals would make very serious effect on very pragmatic, as you told Mr. Putin, and not only deter him for any foreign policy adventures on former Soviet states, but would be, believe me, enthusiastically greeted in Russia, not as anti-Russian measures, but a very pro-Russian measure.
Yeah, there's a question back there, and then the first one far back, and then the first so far back. He had his hand up first, and then to the person in front of you.
Thank you. My name is Pavel Ivlev. I'm from the Institute of Modern Russia, New York.
Institute of what?
Institute of Modern Russia.
Russia.
And I have a question to Leon, if I may, about the what would be your opinion, what would be your preference of the next U.S. government Russia policy? I mean, it's probably a wide question, but should it be more of Ronald Reagan style, or the continuation of Obama reset, or something in between? Thank you.
Well, Leon, I know you've been giving a lot of thought to that issue. Why don't you?
Well, I can't say. Yeah, I can't say much, and everything that I'm saying is just my personal opinion. I think structurally, Putin has put everybody in a situation where it will be very difficult to relaunch a reset. It is my sense that no matter who will be in the White House after this November, there is going to be a period of, depending on how you look at it, cooling off, freezing, frost, cold wind. Putin has said so many things that any U.S. administration would be very hard put to deal with. We all talked about the rhetoric, particularly you. All right, assuming that the rhetoric is turned off and for some reason Putin decides to become a friend of the U.S. Well, first of all, the kinds of things that he said and the length of time. It's not going to be very easy to turn this off and turn the propaganda around. But most importantly, I'm not sure. I mean, look, everybody says Putin is pragmatic. Putin is pragmatic in terms of what well, you know, every foreign policy is rooted in domestic politics in every country, ultimately. For an increasingly wobbly, unstable dictatorship or neo-authoritarianism, the try and true, and it's not just, you know, Russia, yes, has a long record of it, but other dictatorships as well. What you do is you unite people around the flag. How do you do it? You hype up external danger. Well, who is the leading enemy? The U.S. So for all his pragmatism, I think Putin, let me say, will make it difficult for whoever is in the White House, at least in the short run, to deal with this regime. Quite apart from the fact that, you know, its legitimacy is a suspect. Quite apart from the fact that who knows what's going to happen to the demonstrators on the street. But even if somehow that revolt is quelled, I think for domestic political reason, Putin is likely to keep this relationship with the United States at best on a sort of very tepid level. But I think it might be very much in his domestic interests to continue to stress external danger and thus portray those who try to destabilize the regime inside as the fifth column, and those who are trying to criticize him for dealing with the opposition in undemocratic ways as the enemies of Russia. So I think it's going to be very unlikely that a change of the administration or the resumption of the White House by the Obama administration will change things for the better quickly.
Okay, then the person in front of you.
Thank you. Tatiana Indina, Hudson Institute, Wilson Center. Actually, my question was very similar to the question of the previous speaker, but focusing more on domestic issues. I would like to ask Andrei Piantkovsky and Leona Aron, can you please give any prognosis or information regarding the what will be Putin's strategy nationwide in Russia, if he is going to implement any reforms politically, economically, how the situation will be developing these several months and just next term. So what will be his strategy for Russia next term? Thank you.
Well, I already partly answered the question, explaining that no economic reform can be conducted by Putin because the first necessary preliminary condition for any reform is elimination of criminal structures created by him. In our country, there is no such institution of market economy as private property, because property is conditional. It depends on loyalty of so-called owner to political power or government power. In case of food shop in the street, his right of property is dependent of his loyalty to local police chief. In case of owner for a company, it's dependent on his relationship with the president. One of the richest men in the country, Mr. Deripaska, once said that I am ready to give all my wealth in any moment on the one vote of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So it's not a market economy, it's not a capitalism, it's a feudal bureaucratic system. The only strategy of Mr. Putin is keeping power, survival as a leader of the country. I think for the beginning he tried a combination of sticks and carrot, as all dictators. Sticks were demonstrated yesterday in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we'll see it again on December 10th during our next demonstration. I'm planning to return back that time and explore this stick part of strategy personally. As for carrot, it's a new legislation about party put forward by Mr. Medvedev, but it's certainly approved by Mr. Putin. It facilitates organization of new party sharply. If until now it was necessary to keep 50,000 signatures, members of the party, now all of 500. Their calculation is that a lot of protesters in the street will be seduced by this idea, and many parties will be organized very quickly. Well, if you have any ambitious young man can create a party out with 500 members. So they say, well, organized party, there will be 10 liberal party, 10 nationalists, 10 communists preparing compete for position in this party. This is a good occupation and a good instrument to take people out of street. Well, we'll see how it works. He is pragmatic. He will use all the methods, but strategy is only one: to keep his power for life until the end. I know until the end of what? Until the end of Putin or until the end of Russia. This is the different scenario.
Okay, I'm going to collect all the questions and let everybody then make their final comments because we're running out of time. So I have one question.
So I already made my final comment.
Very good. All right. Well, I have one question from the email came in on Sochi Olympic Games, next major project of Putin in light of the security situation, human rights issues in the Caucasus. What are the possible scenarios and how should the international community behave? That's an obvious one for Glenn if he wants it. And let's get all the other questions out. And if you can make a question or a comment or whatever. Wait. Can we get the mic here? Or we want to pick it up for posterity?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Talk from a security point.
One comment, one quick question. The comment is on Stolypin. I don't think Putin is talking about the Stolypin neckties, which of course was used after the 1905 revolution, but Stolypin as a conservative reformer. I mean, I'll give him that much. One of the two things that struck me. One is exactly what is Medvedev trying to show by his alleged relook at the conviction of Khodorkovsky? Is this his last gasp as an alleged liberal? I mean, what's going on with that? Two, in terms of Mr. Howard's comment on the way Russia views its security, looking at Belarus as a key border area. I mean, who the hell are they protecting against? NATO? The Wehrmacht? I mean, this is sort of at the point where, the Russians are going to be spending $750 million, allegedly, on improving the quality of their equipment, and to what end? I mean, and I raise that for everybody.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, so you can answer Sochi, you can answer the gentleman's last question, or you can just make general comments. You've already go ahead.
Yeah, and actually, I asked, I could just 2 sentences on Sochi. I've been watching that, and the file is now bursting, and it is a very interesting situation. There are moments in history of nations that could be called the moments of national shape. And Sochi, which ultimately are good for nations, because they, in the Russian case, the defeat in 2005 by Japan and so on and so forth, they could lead to kind of national renewal and cleansing and whatnot. Sochi is mired in incompetence and corruption. Apart from being the first Olympics that Winter Olympics in the subtropics. Putin signed up for that at the time of a complete oil intoxication. I mean, it's where there were no limits, or seemingly no limits, to his personal power, to what Russia could buy and do and whatnot. Many have spoken about this. Nemtsov, when he ran for the mayor of Sochi, completely debunked the whole idea. So watch for this. Is certainly an event to watch. It could be, in fact, going to, it may be Russia, Cyprus, or Angola, because it could be a moment when all of that, dirt and pus comes out, and they'll realize that something really radically has to be done.
And it corresponds with our prognostic 1 year.
Okay, and did you want anything on either stuff?
Yeah, you comment about Stolypin. I was only making a historical reference to the necktie, and yeah, I do know that he was a reformer as well, but he also had a bad side to him. So, and so, in what was this comment about the other? You had another question. It was,
if I may, it's another long-term interest of mine. Medvedev's own commission, I think a year ago, right? Pretty much a year ago, concluded that there was no substance to certainly in the second trial. Why did it take him a year to say this? I think it's meaningless.
Absolutely.
On the 24th of September, I think deliberately, Putin destroyed Medvedev political. This arms around, this is here's the boy who kept the seat for me for 4 years, and okay, thanks very much, and now I'm ready. By the way, by the polls and by the anecdotes and by the opinions of the protesters and just simply people at the top, for some reason that was the moment that disgusted everybody even more than the election. So his reputation is destroyed. Why? And therefore these types of things are meaningless. The regime made Khodorkovsky into a symbol, and I've been asked about that many times because I've written that the return of Khodorkovsky will be like the return of Sakharov in December of '86, which signified the beginning of the end of the Soviet regime. Now, of course, they're totally different, please, but the regime structured the Khodorkovsky thing in such a way as to make him into a symbol of implacable hostility to the regime and regime's implacable hostility to him. And just like Sakharov, and here they're similar, Khodorkovsky would not bore up his confinement and his harassment and his semi-torturous conditions by the European standards very well. And he, like Sakharov in Gorky, became a symbol of moral resistance to the regime. So for the regime to release him when the demonstrators are already on the street, I think would be very, very dangerous, and I don't think Putin will ever allow anything like this.
All right, with that...
Can I answer the
sure.
question about Sochi?
Yeah, please, I'm sorry.
The issue about Sochi is one that's interesting. By purely picking the location of Sochi Olympics, Putin has created it's a huge logistical obstacle by creating something for where you're going to have over 1 million people coming to the Olympics, and just in getting that whole structure off the ground. Second thing, that by hosting Olympics in an area where close to 1 million Circassians were deported, and many of whom are buried from the deportations in 1864, he's basically created a huge rallying cry among the Circassians with their 7 million strong diaspora in the Middle East and also in other parts of Europe. So that is another second obstacle. Third is that you have an insurgency, and you still have problems in Ingushetia at 800 kilometers away, and he's created a big bullseye for himself. I think Putin is, by having the Sochi Olympics, now the other factors said that, and now he's also has an insurgent thing to worry about for some type of terrorist act. And I would point out in September 2010 or October of 2010, there was a bomb IED that was found in Sochi, and so there's certainly reason there to be concerned. And then the last thing now I think of Sochi is that Sochi could become a big rallying point for the opposition in Russia, and could be a place where they want to get a lot of Westerners' attention. They certainly could do that by demonstrating, and who knows what's going to be in 2 years' time. And then the other obstacle is that Georgia's a little bit peeved off because of the occupation of their territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So it doesn't look good for Sochi in 2014. There's a lot of it'd be very difficult for Putin to pull this one off, but he may do it. So.
Okay, with that, please join me in thanking the panelists, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. Do I have any notes here? I'm going to write up a summary and post on the website. All right.
Oh, notes.
Yeah.